I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen here. I apologize, I have actually closed the door to this room and my cats will not be making an appearance this evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Okay, let's see. Let me stretch this so that you can see my whole slide. All right, so I'll be talking to you today about human-computer interaction and user experience as parts of the information profession, what the field is about and how it's used to design a better information society. So before I get started, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am and where I'm from. So my name's Andrea Forte. I'm a professor. I'm also the department head of the Information Science Department at Drexel University in the College of Computing and Informatics. I used to be an interaction designer before I got a PhD in human-centered computing and began focusing more on research in social and collaborative computing, educational technology, and privacy. So today I'll be talking about human-computer interaction and user experience. These are areas of focus both in my research and in my teaching. In information science, we do a lot of things. I'm sure you're all familiar with different aspects: library science, data science, artificial intelligence, health informatics. We do all of this, but my personal favorite is human-computer interaction and user experience, because that's really where my training lies. So these are fields that provide a uniquely human-centered way of solving problems. Even though they're bound up with technology, they're really always leveraging a human perspective. The kinds of problems range from the biggest kind of societal problems to tiny little problems in all domains. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that HCI UX professionals leverage problem-solving processes to address all of these different kinds of problems. So sometimes people think about user experience or HCI in a very small way. Like it's about tweaking color choices, choosing labels, making the right menu choices available to users of technologies so that they can be easier to use. But these things are important. They're not the full picture. In fact, it's a whole way of thinking about the world. It's an orientation towards solving problems. So the kinds of problems that HCI and user experience professionals solve involve everything from the big kinds of social problems: health disparities, educational disparities, misinformation, traffic accidents, harassment, privacy violations, global warming, discrimination. You will find papers that address each of these problems in literature on how people use computers. There's another kind of set of problems that get addressed very commonly by professionals in this space. And they're problems like ineffective advertising, when sales are lagging for companies, when products are not useful, when training materials are ineffective, workers being late, production being slow, product manuals not being able to be read and used. These are all design problems. These are all problems that design can solve. So you can see that these two different batches of problems come from very different places and are addressed in different ways, but they're all problems that are addressed by human-computer interaction and user experience professionals. So the way that we address these problems, the thing that all of this has in common is the design thinking process. Now, I'm not sure, I'm not sure if you can raise your hands, or I guess we have a chat because I saw some cat related messages popping up. How many folks have heard about design thinking as a way of orienting to the world before? See if I pull up my chat, it's probably going to, yep, you'll be able to see it. All right. Okay, I see some hands. Awesome. Okay, so we have some familiarity with design thinking. In general, these are the different stages that of problem solving that you kind of proceed through. And you'll see there's lots of arrows on here because this is generally not a serial process where you go from just one stage to the next stage. It's very much iterative, and anyone who's had any contact with user experience in the past knows that iteration is a fundamental tenet. This is a process that is at the core of the HCI and UX professions. Almost every company, every organization, every research group that you encounter will use some variant of this process. The labels might be different, but the process is the same. So we'll go through and talk a little bit about what each of these means. Empathizing, understanding people, understanding how people do things, why they do it the way they do it, how they think, what their constraints are, what they'd like life to be like, getting to know the world from a particular perspective is what empathizing is all about. Often when I talk to people, empathy is viewed as a quality that a person either has or doesn't have. And in fact, it's a set of skills and techniques that are developed to be able to see into the worlds of people who are unlike yourself. So it's a skill that people develop. It's not something that you either intrinsically have or don't have. So that's the first step in understanding how to address a problem, is empathizing with the people who are involved in some capacity in the problem being examined. And the second step is problematizing, so framing the problem. So if we already know what the problem is we want to address, how is it that we're framing a problem in the second step? So the problem, an example of a problem you might want to address is someone not eating healthy, some group of people not eating healthy. So in my case, if I'm not eating healthy, is the problem that I don't know what's healthy to eat? Is it a problem that I can't afford what's healthy? Is it a problem that I don't have time to make healthy food, although I have it? Each of these problem framings will suggest a different kind of solution. And so through the process of empathizing with people, you learn about what the actual root of the problem is and how to frame that problem in such a way that your designs will be able to address it. So after you've understood your problem, then comes, in my opinion, one of the really fun parts, which is ideation. How many different ways can we think of to solve this problem? In the domains of HCI and user experience, so often we're talking about technologies. That's not always the solution, even though it's often the solution we come up with. But ideation gives us latitude to think of anything, any kind of solution that we might want to, and the sky's the limit. So once we've come up with lots of ideas, we start prototyping. We narrow those down into the most likely candidates and create a version of the proposed solution that can be used to address the problem. And then finally, we test that prototype and we go back and try it again. So this is kind of a high level view of what the process looks like. I would like to dive into an example of a major problem in society that design thinking can help us get a handle on. This is an example of a project that my design team worked on for some time. And the problem it addressed is the fact that people often find bad information online. This is a huge problem. It's a problem that gets a lot of attention. In fact, when we started doing this project, it was prior to 2016. And some of the work happened after, and some of the work happened before. 2016 is a bit of a watershed moment for the problem of misinformation. Whoops, sorry, I accidentally muted myself. When it became highly visible to a lot of folks. So the context in which this work was done changed a bit, but I like to consider it ahead of its time. I like to consider it being ahead of its time. So the first thing I did was empathize with people. And when you learn HCI and user experience, these are the kinds of techniques that you learn for empathizing. So we did an interview diary study for, we had 20 people keep a search diary for 7 days. And what they did was they just kept a record of the things that they searched for and took notes about what they looked for, whether they found it, and how they knew when they found the answer that they were looking for. So after we got all those diary entries, excuse me, I'm a little bit sick and I have to cough, but I don't want to cough in all your ears. Sorry about that. We followed up with interviews so that we could ask them questions. You know, when they were searching, step us through it. Let us know, you know, how that went for you. And then finally, once we had all this data, we had to do an analysis to understand what we had found. And we used an inductive approach, which means we weren't doing an experiment. We were exploring the data to figure out what are the themes that we could identify across all these different people in the ways that they were looking for information, and how they were assessing it and how they knew that they knew that they had found what they were looking for. So this is what I did. What did I learn? Everyone looks for citations. Citations are a big marker of information being credible and good, and that we can trust it. But people just look at whether the citations are there, and how many there are, not at the quality of the citations so much. And it was a more complicated study. We asked a bunch of different types of people, but in general, the number of citations was something that all of the different groups we looked at considered to be important. And they also, in some cases, think about the reason the information's there in the first place. How did it get to be there? Who's making sure it's correct? Is there a process for maintaining it? So mostly all about where did the information come from, but then also a little bit about how does that information get groomed, make sure it's good. So that's how we empathize. Diary study plus interviews. So then how do we problematize this? If you think about what we learned about people looking for references and information about why that information exists. Where did it come from? So here's my problem statement. In order to better assess information they find online, internet users need clear cues about where information comes from and how it's maintained. So these introduce design concepts of provenance and stewardship. Provenance, where did it come from? What's its origins? Stewardship, how's it maintained? Who takes care of it? So there we have a very clear problem to solve. How are we going to do that? How do we develop an interface that addresses this? So ideation is one of the major tools that people use for ideation is, of course, brainstorming. And I'm sure that if I ask people to raise their hand, almost everyone will have been in a room with a stack of Post-it notes at some point coming up with ideas. Ideation, there are lots of other techniques or techniques that are used to enhance brainstorming activities. But the idea here was, how could we come up with ideas about signaling things about information provenance and stewardship? And to be honest, I did not maintain, I didn't keep the original set of ideas that we came up with, but I do remember several highlighting different types of references. Like if people were looking just, are there references? Well, could we show them that there were different kinds of references, like peer-reviewed and news articles and that sort of thing? Could we color code references to sources of different quality? Like, did we want to make a judgment for them and say, ooh, this has lots of green references, it must be a really strongly supported piece of information? Should we provide an indicator that other people have reviewed the material? That would be an indicator of how the information is maintained. Providing an assessment of the information directly. This is good information, this is bad information. Polling readers to collect information about how good they think it is and then share it with later people who come along. Providing tips for readership. all of these are just different directions that we could go in. And I'll show you what we did. This is not the most exciting information visualization in the world, but what we decided to do was prototype with Wikipedia, because where else do you go if you want to see how good people are at assessing information quality, or how trustworthy information is? Great way to test that. It's not very well understood as a resource. People don't understand how it's produced. In fact, that's the case. We did interviews and that's what we found. And it definitely has references sometimes. So there's a lot of variability in terms of these different signals that we identified as important to people. So what we did was we made up two visualizations. If you look, I think you can see my pointer. We had one that's a very sophisticated visualization called a pie chart that shows how many of the references are, for example, peer-reviewed or books or uncategorized references. And then down here, we have a little thermometer. And as it turns out, Wikipedia has a process for moving articles through different stages of quality control. So there are stubs, which are the very beginnings of articles, and then you have C class and B class and A class, and then you have featured articles, which are sometimes featured on the front page, and they have to go through a long process of vetting and revision before they get there. But most people don't know that. So these are features of articles that could be used to assess how good they might be, that most people don't pay attention to. And we thought, well, if we create visualizations that give them these cues, maybe we can affect the way they make judgments about these articles. And so that's what we did. So that's our prototype. And here's how we tested it. So for testing, you see on the right here, there's two exact copies of the same Wikipedia article, but one of them has one of our visualizations slapped on top. The visualization reflects the content of the article, but it's it's not real. We didn't actually create the underlying code and the program that would generate this visualization. We just created a kind of fake Wikipedia page, and then we used the online system Mechanical Turk. Can I see a show of hands for how many people know what Mechanical Turk is? All right, that's not a huge number of people. I'm just going to real quick explain. So Mechanical Turk is basically like it's a system where you can ask people to do little jobs online. Things like categorizing pictures or taking a survey, things that can be done online. And you can pay them micropayments, that you can pay them small amounts of money for performing a task. Now there's a lot more. Mechanical Turk's not the only platform that you can do this on, but it's one of them. And so we paid people, and I will note that when we run studies like this, when we're asking people to do things online, we calculate what a living wage would be given the amount of time that we're asking them to commit, and then we use the location of Drexel University, which is the research site. So whatever a living wage is in Drexel University, we pay that much. We try to pay approximately that much for people's time. So the ethics of running these studies is another big area of focus in HCI and user experience. So we used Mechanical Turk, and we offered people $1.50 to take our survey or whatever it was. And the way that Mechanical Turk works is when you pay them, it gets, they do a bunch of tasks and then they can collect their money. And we asked them to look at articles. So look at this domestication article and then answer a bunch of questions about how trustworthy you think it is, how good the information is, and give us comments about why you think that. And so some people saw articles without any visualization. Some people saw articles with a visualization that showed what we believed to represent a good article, lots of peer-reviewed sources, that sort of a thing. Or in the case of the thermometer, where it's really high, like up to featured article, And then some people saw visualizations that suggested the article might not be so good. The way that we built the visualization was that it didn't have very many peer-reviewed or any peer-reviewed articles, lots of unknowns, undetermined sources, fewer, and then in the thermometer, it would be like, a very low, just the start of an article. So we showed this to lots of people on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And this is what we found. We had 244 participants who made 682 article assessments. And I won't go through all the statistics of what the results were, but I'll give you the main points. So we confirmed that the visualizations, when we placed them on a Wikipedia page, predicted the effects that we expected to see. So people rated articles with vizzes that we thought communicated high quality higher than people who saw vizzes with low quality information. And we also were able to observe a few things about the kinds of people who were assessing articles. So the viz about how far an article had progressed in the Wikipedia classification system had more of an effect than the visualization about where the information came from, references, which was really surprising to me because I thought references were so immediately understandable. But it generally it was the stewardship visualization that had more of an effect, especially among non-Wikipedia editors. So people who were used to editing Wikipedia and knew how it worked were actually less affected by the Wikipedia visualization, which makes sense because they already understood it. So it didn't affect their judgment. Whereas people who don't edit and don't have a clear sense of how Wikipedia work were affected by this visualization that gave them some insight into it. And then the provenance viz, where information comes from, the references, had a very strong effect among people with graduate degrees, which also makes sense because the longer you stay in school, the more you're trained to pay attention to references. And finally, and this is maybe one of the most interesting, especially considering the years of work that have come since then, people on the highest and lowest ends of the education spectrum were the hardest to affect with any visualization at all. So folks who are either extremely well trained or have little contact with information assessment practices that comes with formal education were difficult to move with these visualizations. So it's that big thick middle that we're really most interested in improving, and that's a bit heartening. I think it's good news, if anything. So that's an example of going through the entire process, the entire design thinking process to address what is a really big problem in a little tiny small slice. And that's what my team does. We learned something about how to build information interfaces that help people make good decisions about information. It's an example of a classic HCI user experience process. It is coming from an academic context, and it's one tiny small step, but you can imagine how this same process can be used to investigate all kinds of features of user populations, whether it's, Wikipedia users, fine, but there are lots of different products out there that need improvement. There are lots of different information resources that need improvement. And the everyday kinds of improvements that we make in the workplace, whether it's a business, a library, a hospital, design thinking can be used as a process to address those things. So in user experience, you learn how to make the world better. It's not just about humans adapting to technology, but about adapting technology to humans. I'm going to pause for a second. I want to talk about one additional context that that is top of mind for a lot of people. Misinformation is one of them. But I want to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions that I can answer or comments. Sorry. Quiet group? That's cool. All right. So the other context that I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I thought about whether I wanted to present a little mini study like this, and I decided not to, because I don't want to go through a lot of findings in this context. I'd like to just raise some really big problems that the world is facing, and to just introduce some contexts in which design thinking plays a role in finding solutions. So one of the other areas that I do a lot of research in is social media. One of the reasons why I'm so interested in social and collaborative computing is because my background, I come from humanities and social sciences. When I was an undergraduate, I was doing philosophy and language. And so the reason why I was interested in philosophy and language was because that was, it seemed to me, where you study the big human questions. How do people, the big things, the love and the war and the questioning reality and who am I? And that was exciting to me, these big human questions. And as I later got a Master of Science in Information from the University of Texas at Austin. And at that time, I started to notice that people were doing really big human things on computers. So people were falling in love and bullying each other and maintaining relationships, and there was war, and there were all of these huge human interesting experiences that I had been so passionate about diving into as an undergraduate. I hadn't even noticed that they were happening online. So I started off far away from computing related disciplines, maybe as far away as you can get, and ended up finding the big questions were playing out in these computer mediated environments. And that meant that designers of systems where people fall in love and bully each other and learn and worship and do these fundamentally human things had an extraordinary amount of power. The people who build these systems are the ones who are responsible for, as I said, adapting the technology to the humans. So often we think about humans becoming adapted to technology. And I think the world is getting better at holding technology creators accountable, but whether or not they're deserving of that responsibility remains to be seen. And I think that's, to me, a huge part of what HCI and user experience does in the world is should be keeping us honest about the role of technology, the good impacts, the negative impacts. So it's been with a lot of interest that I've been reading about, the Facebook memos, where the acknowledgement of negative impacts on teens, or a lot of Facebook memos over the years related to privacy, related to mental health issues in various populations. And so I've continued this work, looking at issues like harassment, looking at issues like privacy violations, and trying to understand the differential impacts on different groups of people. This is user experience. This is HCI. So I know that this was billed as an hour-long session, but I had planned for a half hour. So with that, I will leave you with the thought that HCI and UX is really about developing human-centered solutions to the world's problems, big or small. And I'm happy to take questions now, or if you think of things later, I've got my email up there, and you're absolutely welcome to contact me. So I see whoops, I'm going to scoot my screen over a little bit so I can see the full chat window. So I see a question about school librarianship and whether user experience is a useful field. I mean, I really think it depends on your career goals. I mean, certainly I would recommend understanding design thinking to anyone in any field. There are literally books about it, applying it in, probably 10 different areas, because it's such a fundamentally productive way of looking at the world. So school libraries, I do a lot of work, I have an MLIS. I do a lot of work with our library science faculty looking at how young people engage with information resources. So I've done studies on things like, how do young people use their online networks to find information? When do they turn to their online networks versus other kinds of resources that they might use, whether it's in a library or online? So there's a lot of overlap between HCI and the library sciences because of this fundamental interest in users and how people find and use information. So I recommend it as, I would definitely look into it, read a book about it, see if it's something that sparks your passion and interest. Okay, how might HCI UX help to circumvent inherent issues of confirmation bias and surveillance capitalism within the ongoing news cycles concerning social media algorithms that strive to build economic incentives? So I think there's a lot in that question. One of my interests has been how people engage with information in the context of surveillance capitalism and of privacy issues, when people are forced to give information in order to access public sphere. It's not just goods. It's not just things. It's not just Facebook. If you want to get online and have conversations with the people, but if you want to get online about political issues, the very act of online means you're revealing things about yourself. You're revealing your interests. You're revealing your search patterns. And so one of my interests is actually in how do we design systems all the way from the infrastructure of the internet to the top layer, the interfaces that people see, that do not use dark patterns, that do not use manipulative ways of getting people to divulge more information than they need to. There's a huge set of HCI and user experience. So one thing to understand is HCI tends to be used to refer to an academic field. So there's a lot of research in HCI that examines issues like how do we build privacy-friendly infrastructures and things like that so that we can have commerce without giving up too much. And then user experience tends to be more of the industry side, the job title, for helping improve product, helping improve customer experiences, those kinds of more industry-oriented kinds of professional positions. So it's at some point when you're talking about these big problems, it's hard to put them together anymore because they are sort of examining different kinds of problems. So it's a super good question and so many answers to it that I could talk for the rest of the time on it, but it's a great question and definitely one of interest to this community. Generated language. Ooh, this is such a good one, especially in the context of social media where a person might not realize they're viewing artificially generated information. This is actually exactly an area of research that I'm in the process of bootstrapping right now, is how do people, and there's a lot of interest in this, I'm not the only one doing it, how do people interpret the behavior of algorithms? We're not all that great at interpreting the behavior of people online. How are people interpreting what's going on when the content that they're seeing, whether it's language or there's sometimes automatically generated tags or automatically generated warnings, or there are all these computational features of our social world now that's embedded into the systems that we use. So I mean, my thought is that it's extraordinarily interesting. People are very bad at it from the research that I've read so far. People are bad at identifying when it's happening and understanding the power of the systems to make inferences about them. Yeah, it's a huge area of research that's only going to expand. Information visualization. Well, I got to be honest here. You saw my pie chart. I'm not really an InfoVis specialist, surprising to say. So for visualization, I'm not the right person to ask. If I had my colleagues around me, I could point you to several people who do really innovative work around developing information visualizations, but it ain't me. I'm sorry. These are really fantastic questions, though. I'm very excited to hear them. And I guess if we don't have any more questions, and I'll give a good pause, make sure nobody does, then I guess we'll wrap it up. And I really do encourage you to, reach out, let me know if there are more things that you think about in terms of what HCI is about, what are the ways that it engages with these kinds of different problems. I'm a researcher at heart, that's what I do. So answering questions is the biggest part of what I do. I do small scale prototyping, but there's lots of parts of the HCI, of the design thinking process, that other people are even better equipped to answer. And I'm more than happy to connect you with others if you have interests that are not my own. So thanks, everyone.